Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. My next interview is with a guy I think you're going to find fascinating. He has so many stories to tell, and it's almost unfair to try to cram everything into a short podcast. Elder Bob, or Great Bear, Bob Phillips. He holds a PhD in Indigenous Studies. He's an advocate for First Nations communities, and he's a great guy. You're going to love this interview. He recently returned to Burnamthorpe Collegiate to deliver the graduating address 55 years after being expelled from the school. We talk about racism. We talk about why he's optimistic still. Why is he still hopeful after all these years? We talk about common social attitudes and urban reconciliation, and we talk about things, frankly, we talk about a great deal of things that matter here, not only for us as Canadians and as individuals, but also, I think, globally as well. So there's lessons learned here for everybody. Lots of great stories, lots of great things to listen in for. So I hope you're going to enjoy this. Don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about other podcasts. And also, I think by now we will have broken the 200 podcast interview goal. So stay tuned for more. And we're coming up now with Bob Phillips. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are joined by another very special guest today. He is an educator. He's an Indigenous Studies and Aboriginal Arts specialist. He has a PhD. He's a doctor, Dr. Bob Phillips. He's got a lot going on, actually, this guy. I think we're going to find out some pretty interesting things about him. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Do I have to call you doctor? Or
no, Bob is
Professor?
Perfect.
Sir?
No. As a matter of fact, since the PhD is fairly recent, I'm still not used to being called Dr. Bob.
Right. Yeah, that's funny.
It is funny, and we can perhaps talk a little bit about how that came to be and everything else.
I'd love to, and I'm fascinated by the fact that you're an Aboriginal arts specialist. There's so many things we can talk about, and you spent 10 years, I think our listeners need to know, 10 years on the Aboriginal Voices Radio Network out of Trent, is that right?
No. The Aboriginal Voices Radio Network was a set of stations run by Native people. And for 10 years, if you tuned into 106.5 FM, Aboriginal Voices Radio, you heard me on the AVR Arts Review. But now the CRTC has pulled all of the licenses. Essentially, they felt that the station wasn't living up to the requirement to deal with the Native community properly.
So what do you mean by that? That's certainly
well,
not living up. Was it standards or reporting, or is that sort of what you mean? When
I first started at Aboriginal Voices Radio, there was a guy named Gary Farmer. And Gary Farmer he really is a visionary. Gary Farmer started a magazine or a journal type of thing, Aboriginal Voices, and then ultimately pushed to have a radio station, Aboriginal Voices Radio. When I first started, he was still involved with the station, and the station had all kinds of Native people involved with it, and that, but there was a non-Native guy who controlled it. After the licenses were granted by the CRTC from essentially Ottawa right through to Vancouver, the station then, instead of going live to air, became something that was pre-recorded. And it went through a certain amount of financial difficulty that I believe was related to breaking away from non-Native control into Native control. But the station, although it lasted for 10 years and was very good at that, I believe that the mainstream concept of let's have a very good music station or something of that nature sort of took over, as opposed to talk shows and things that really link different parts of the Aboriginal community. So it did marvelous things to a certain extent, but to another extent it didn't. And so ultimately the CRTC pulled the licenses. It's my understanding that today they're looking for non-native audiences, probably to increase funding one way or another.
Sure. And it's never an either-or thing in these kinds of decisions and so on, and I'm sure it was fairly subtle and nuanced and so on, but still disappointing nevertheless.
Disappointing, but the Native people who were actually running the station did a marvelous job for many, many years. And if that station has now started to move in a different direction, the only thing that I can think of is that there was pressure to do that from outside sources, like, for example, advertisers or what have you.
Right. Well, definitely. Listen, as I've found out as a podcaster and as I go a tiny bit deeper into the radio world and the media world, it's wow. To say it's changing is an understatement, right? Things, a very different model than it used to be. That's for sure. So it's a little challenging out there, from what I'm finding.
Well, as it happens, that's one of the reasons I'm very happy to sit here with you today.
That's great.
Well, you have a depth of experience with podcasting.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Now, I really thought very, very highly of Aboriginal Voices Radio because it was one of the ways that we could share information through the Native community right across Canada. And I did that as a volunteer for 10 years.
Wow,
I was not an employee.
Oh, okay.
So now that it's gone, I understood the value of it, which is why I volunteered to support that. So what can replace it? One of the problems with an FM station is that it has a geographical limit. You're limited to the city in which you're broadcasting.
Yep.
Podcasting, on the other hand, so someone from, let's say, Attawapiskat could record something and ship it via the internet, and that could then go out as a podcast or whatever. There must be ways to link the rest of the country.
There's so many marvelous ways to do it, and I think it's really new still, but the stats are crazy. So 37 to 40 million people listened to a podcast last week alone, and about 60% of that group listened to 5 or more. I mean, this is remarkable, and there's an age demographic that it's skewing towards. More older folk are picking up on it. I have listeners. I don't have a lot of listeners yet for Face to Face, but I have listeners in about 22 countries. I mean, how amazing is that? How crazy is that? This is a platform that I could never have dreamed of having 20, 25 years ago, less.
Which is precisely the reason that I'm so interested in things like podcasts. Here in Toronto, everybody comes to Toronto. So you can imagine sitting here with a microphone in Toronto, I have people from Nunavut or from the West Coast or the East Coast, from Australia or from Japan. All kinds of people have come. So
let's actually, for a brief moment, because I think it might be a nice entry point into a whole lot of things that we can talk about. I just want to say too that Dr. Phillips came into my class recently at Humber College and was kind enough to put on a blanket, what's called a blanket ceremony. And for those of you, I'll let Bob tell you about it more, but I've been through a couple of them now, and it's really quite a humbling and rewarding experience on a whole lot of levels, historically, relationally. To get a better sense for what was going on over the past 500 years here in the country I call home. And so I'm going to let you talk about that more in a second, Bob. But what would your radio show be about? And then we're going to talk about how you returned to Burnamthorpe Collegiate 55 years later after being expelled. And maybe that's what your show is going to be about.
Well, the radio show was about, and hopefully, if podcasting can come out of this, which it could very easily be, it was not about me. Surprisingly enough, it was not about me. It was about the people that I was interviewing. Now, where are Aboriginal artists or community members with specific issues that they're dealing with, where are they going to get national exposure? Even at times, I would find myself at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Duke Redbird would be there with City TV getting ready to interview people, and they'd be combing their hair, and I'd be there with my microphone. They were all lining up for that. But in that case, maybe 30 seconds on the air, broadcast locally, and my show was a full half hour.
Drop in the bucket, yeah.
And the artist could talk about why they were doing something.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the reasons I love it too, is you can get a little deeper, right? You can go a little deeper than that soundbite.
Well, that show that you put up the last time there about the difficulties that faced Newfoundlander soldiers.
Yes. Newfoundland and Armageddon. Yes.
Armageddon.
First World War.
I had no idea about that.
Yeah, Brian McKenna's film. Same. Me too. Too. I mean, I knew Canada had involvement, but not to that degree. I mean, and for me, Bob, the insight there was, for so many of us celebrating Canada Day as a holiday and so on, for Newfoundlanders, this is a Remembrance Day. Talk about turning it on its head.
Especially since those people were killed.
Yes.
Just
slaughtered, basically.
Slaughtered. Which brings us perhaps back to maybe some of the reasons why I'm involved with this. And this is the history of how Native people have been treated.
Well, you strike me as a guy who, when people say, oh, David loves to talk, it sometimes has a little bit of a pejorative edge to it. There's a little bit of a negative tone. Oh yeah, we can never get David to shut up. But I hope anyway, that it's really about relationship, and it's really about digging deeper. And I get that sense from you. You know, you led the talking circles in my class, and with the talking feathers, and how each person got a chance to reflect on the blanket ceremonies. I get this sense from you that you've been doing that for quite some time, that kind of thing, whether it was on radio, whether it was in a coffee shop, or whether it was out on a boat on Lake Ontario. You would be doing that kind of work, it seems to me.
You touched on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. First of all, I build my own kayaks and tow them down to the lake and paddle around out there. But perhaps we can go into that business about how long I have been doing this.
Yeah, please. Give us some history, context.
Well, you pointed out that you're going to ask me about that article.
Yes.
The Burnamthorpe article. So perhaps I could begin by giving you...
Can I read the headline?
Sure.
Here it is, July 6th, 2016, InsideToronto.com. Man returns to Burnamthorpe Collegiate to deliver graduating address 55 years after being expelled from the same school. Dr. Bob Phillips of Mi'kmaq heritage now holds a PhD in Indigenous Studies.
Perfect. Now, I grew up in the west end of Toronto, out by the 6 Points. And there was a great deal of denial in my family about Native heritage. I remember at one particular point in time, the old black telephone on the wall would start ringing about supper time. The other kids in the class would be phoning, asking what the answers to the homework was. And I didn't even have to look at a book or anything. I would tell them. One day, a little blonde girl, whom I had given all of the answers to the night before, she got a star and I didn't. And I asked the teacher, why didn't I get a star? I didn't tell her that I had the same answers. The teacher screwed her face up. She said, it's because she writes better than you do. Now you sit up straight like a good little brave and you be quiet. After that, I really never did homework. There was no point in doing homework, and the phone ultimately stopped ringing because I was... So that kind of thing. Now, not all teachers treated me badly, right. But today I've come to realize that back in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, the same social attitudes that were responsible for and current in the residential school system were also current right here in Toronto, to the extent Why, for example, would a teacher tell a 9 or 10-year-old kid repeatedly, you should be in reform school? We didn't have drugs and alcohol and gangs or anything. Why would you do that? They were actually talking about reforms, residential school. So now, having grown up with that sort of thing, for one thing, I didn't learn how to study. I had no idea as to how to control my marks. Sometimes they would be very good, at other times just terrible. I had no control over that. And I was just, by the time I got to Burnamthorpe Collegiate, that was something else again. Especially since in grade 12, at the end of the year, I failed. I failed grade 12. Now, how did that happen? Because I was never really in danger of failing. Anyway, the next year I had to go back to Burnamthorpe. And the French teacher was my homeroom teacher. As soon as I met him, it was, you sit in the back of the class and you be quiet. And
wow.
Essentially, he never called me an Indian, but he certainly treated me that way. And detention after detention after detention all the time. Finally, at one point, there were fire alarms going off, and I stood up. I was arguing the fact that I shouldn't have had the detention. And I mean, it was way past the time that normal detentions would end anyway. And I was standing close to his desk, not close to him, but close to his desk. All of a sudden, the man said, step back, step back. Don't you tower over me. Now you get out of my classroom. So I left. That was the last time I was at Burnamthorpe. I had to finish by driving back and forth to Acton, Ontario. The adult leader of the Rover Scout crew that I was a part of was vice principal out there. And then the principal said, look, we have to have something to be able to enroll you. You can go to class, but I need something. You bring your report card.
Sure. When
I brought the report card, about a week later, he called me down to his office and he said, you see the whiteout here on the total? I said, yeah, they must have made a mistake. He said, they certainly did, because if you total all of the marks, you did not fail. Now, his opinion was that, and I remember back in those days, Burnamthorpe Collegiate and high schools got some kind of advantage, whether it was financial or what, if they had a high percentage of people graduating in grade 13.
Right.
And so that principal felt that in order to protect that, anybody that might be close was dropped out, was failed of grade 12. Now, that in itself did not occur because I was a North American Indian. But what led to that was back in public school, you sit up straight like a good little Indian and you be quiet. And so the kind of treatment that occurred during that time.
So the ideology, the thinking in the residential school environment was not just indicative of that ethos. It spread out elsewhere, and it was cultural to some degree. Is that fair?
All you had to do was look at the cowboy and Indian movies that were so current back in those days, where the native was primitive, he was stupid, you couldn't teach him anything, he was a savage and had to be dealt with.
Right.
Now, growing up, the people that I saw on television were non-native people wearing wigs and things like that. There was only Tonto with the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and he was my role model. And today I actually know many of his descendants, which is rather surprising.
That's pretty interesting.
So coming home from school, after that teacher said, you sit up straight like a good little Indian and you be quiet. So when she said that, I sat up straight with my arms folded across my chest like the Indians I saw in the comic books. And when I got home, I was proud of myself. I asked Mom, hey, am I an Indian? She said, she just went nuts. She said, don't you ever tell anybody that. You tell them you're English, French, and Scotch. Your great-grandfather would roll over in his grave if he ever heard you say that. Why would he have rolled over in his grave? It's because the man bought a farm about a mile outside of the Pictou Landing Reserve in Nova Scotia. Once a Native person owned property or went to a university or all kinds of things like that, you cease to be a Native person.
Interesting. So once you sort of stepped into another world of privilege almost, or acquisition of some kind, you had capital, I guess you could almost say. You were no longer Native.
It was called,
or you were no longer seen as Native. Is that what you mean? Or
it was called enfranchisement, and it went on right through until about 1950. With enfranchisement.
Oh, you're not just speaking metaphorically.
I'm speaking about laws.
Right, laws. Yeah, good.
And someone actually pointed out to me that in the United States, they wanted to keep slaves anyway. If you had one drop of black blood or not white blood, you ceased to be white. You were, as long as you had one drop of black blood, you were black. So to stay on the, but with Native people, it was the reverse. You wanted to get rid of Native people because you wanted the land and that sort of thing.
Right.
So enfranchisement. And why would my great-grandfather do that, knowing that he would lose all status for himself and everybody else? Well, my mom grew up maybe 5 or 6 miles from the Shubenacadie Residential School. And if a child reached 5 or 6 years old, the government came, took your child, put them into a school miles and miles away. You might be lucky and see that child for a week or so in the summer. But the child also could, all kinds of children died in those things. They were mistreated.
When I hear you speak it like that, Bob, it's just remarkable to me that I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, Spencer and Victoria, and I just, you know what I mean? It makes me angry.
Well, can you imagine if those children were taken away by the government?
By the government, yeah.
Now,
for your own good.
In Canada, we tend to think that, oh no, Canada is a very democratic country and everything else. But now, very few people, I didn't understand until I was an adult that those kind of schools were doing that. And the complex issues.
You didn't know how deep it went.
I had no idea.
No idea. No.
So then, actually, Chris Glover, who is the school board trustee out in Etobicoke, he was talking to, there's a woman at Burnamthorpe Collegiate, which is now an adult learning center, and she's responsible for some kind of courses associated with Aboriginal culture. And he suggested that she have me come and speak to her class. Well, the principal decided when he heard, he said, no, you have to speak to the whole school.
Nice.
Yeah, so okay, I did an 1.5-hour lecture to the entire school in the auditorium. There was a standing ovation, everybody understood. And when that finished, the man said, you have to come back to graduation. And to my delight, and of course I said yes. I gave like a 5-minute little speech.
Right.
But I was the only doctor on that stage.
It's impressive.
And 55 years after being thrown out of that school, why would a French teacher throw me out of school? For one thing, now, back in those days, I didn't speak other languages, but today, en français, aucun problème avec ça du tout. So French, no problem. Parlo anche l'italiano. Non è meglio, per esempio, abbastanza bene perché, anyway, Italian. In all'iniches demilato scola all'amore si poli me per poli. I have to gloss some Greek because I had a Greek girlfriend at one point. So why would someone, and I mean, I'm very good with languages. The only explanation that I can find as an adult as to why I was thrown out of that school is if you have a look at my eye structure, my high cheekbones, a round face, in those days, a deep tan in the summertime, jet black hair, what is an Indian doing in my class? And it's surprising how that sort of thing. Now, I have to also point out that the Toronto District School Board was not involved with that. That was the Etobicoke School Board that is now defunct because the TDSB, after amalgamation, came out of that. And in visiting classes with the blanket exercises and things like that, What I see is that today, that kind of overt racism, I don't see that in there. If it's there, it's got to be very quiet. On the other hand, when you're looking at the difficulties that Native people can face today, supposing that a kid who speaks, if his parents speak Ojibwe at home, and then he goes to class and you give him a spelling test in English, of course he's going to fail it. And then if you look at him as being stupid, and it could very easily be that his parents don't speak Ojibwe, but maybe they speak a dialect of English. Again, you ask a kid to do a spelling test, and the chances are the kid is going to flunk it. On the other hand, when I look around many classrooms today, what I see is a wide variety of people from literally all over the world. And I'll bet you that many of them speak another language at home. And again,
it's part of being Canadian on some level.
So if that's the case, if they fail a spelling test in English, why would you say, okay, special ed? In other words, I believe that there are many, many problems that still exist today that could be very easily taken care of if we open our minds to see everyone else as being an equal part of the circle.
Bob, do you think, so you're an educator, clearly you ran for the Toronto District
Yes,
School
I
Board.
did.
We can talk about that. You're a speaker, you're an artist, you're a broadcaster, etc. All these things that you've done over the years. But is this issue, and it's so silly to try to reduce it to one question, but is it really about the white folk, the white Canadians, us, most of us, getting a better understanding, having a better understanding of what First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are trying to say? Is that where we got to start? Like, for the love, start listening just a little bit more? Because, I think, I know that's a problem in development. You know, students go overseas and they bring these white, Western, global Northern solutions supposedly to global Southern communities, the majority world, and say, we figured it out, here's what you need to do. Well, actually, no, that's really not the best way to go. It's not the wisest approach. It might work in some cases, but certainly not in all. And there's nuances, and there's subtleties, and there's tradition, and there's culture, and there's language, all these things that are difficult and complex. How do you even begin if you haven't got an understanding of, and this is why the blanket exercise for me was just so humbling and revealing, when I did it the first time a few years ago.
So let's start by separating out white. Many of the colonial people who have brought us to where we are were not white. They actually were parts of the colonized areas and just continued on. Why? I don't think it's because it's white or black or North American Indian.
It's fun just saying white.
Yeah, it is. And
there is something kind of fun about that,
well,
right?
also, if you have a
white,
look at
wealthy, privileged.
Exactly.
Right? There is something, yeah.
But when
colonial
you're talking,
is a better approach.
Colonialism is a major problem. And when you have a look at what happened to North American Native people, when the colonizers showed up here, for example, in terms of religion, they had the feeling that we were devil worshippers, that we worshipped devil type of creatures or people. If we had extraordinary respect for a wolf, for example, that's terrible. What they didn't realize, and actually in Native culture, we think very highly of things like Mother Earth or Grandmother Moon, Noki Muskizes. If there's a particular very often I'll take my kayak, I'll find a quiet beach, I'll put my blanket out in my pipe and I'll sing songs to Noki Muskizes, to Grandmother Moon, saying thank you for the gifts that I've been given. Now, if you think back to pre-contact, when Western Europeans arrived here, they would have seen that as devil worship.
Of course, yeah. Don't understand it, fear it on some level, so therefore it must be dangerous.
Exactly. And so what they would do then is to protect themselves. They would pray to saints or to, in other words, the Western European had the same kind of view of the world, except they didn't really understand what we were talking about. And so now, if you're going into other countries for development and that sort of thing, if you become aware of the fact that Native people have been badly treated, and today it's not just Native people. If you go into certain parts of Toronto here where you find heavy black populations and many of them being arrested or sent to a jail for very little reason, or not necessarily even gaining a sound education. There are a lot of parallels there. So if you have a look at some of those things, Canada is thought to be, oh, we're so democratic, we're above all of that.
Yeah.
Well, if you're talking to somebody from a different country about their Indigenous people, the chances are that a lot has been hidden there as well. And if you're aware of what happened to Native people, then maybe you can be a little suspect about, oh, no, our Native people never had that kind of a problem, or
Right,
yeah.
right. Do you find, Bob, so we need to get to the truth. Isn't that really the question? Have we got there yet? You know?
Well, what's the truth?
Yeah, well, true, fair enough.
That's a philosophical question in itself.
Yeah.
One good way to look at that, because I was just mentioning religion and the comparison between religion. In Native culture, I don't consider myself to be particularly religious, but I am very spiritual, and especially as a pipe carrier and that sort of thing. And so when I'm thinking about Kitchi Manitou, I'm thinking about the great mystery, about the creator, who and what. I mean, it truly is a mystery. Well, our culture isn't the only one that sees that as a mystery. Everybody in the world has sooner or later asked themselves, what are we doing here, and who's greater? How do we get here? And so perhaps looking to understand that we all have many, many things in common is much better than looking at the differences.
Yeah, starting from a similar, finding similarity through difference. Why is that such an odd notion? Why is that so difficult? Instead of starting from a position of fear and of the other, how about with an embrace? And maybe it's easier to talk about than it is actually to get there, but I think a lot of it does have to do with listening, understanding, and being inclusive, and being open, right? Not so rigid. And I think back to our school systems and teaching in them from time to time, I still see a deep rigidity. Structure, this is the way it is, either or, it's black and white, it's up and down, it's positive, it's negative, right? There's very little room for nuance and dialogue and participation. I guess that's what I sort of meant by getting to the truth, getting to the relational, the real stuff of what it is that's going on here in our country, but also in communities throughout. How many different nations? Is it around 600 in Canada? Is that
I haven't really specifically, I'd have to go and look that up. I know that there are 60 different native languages still spoken today.
Wow.
Here in Canada. And that is far more than all the Western European languages combined. On the other hand, this morning I was walking down the street on my way to the subway, and there's a guy that I've known for years. We stopped and we're chatting, and he said, "Well, Bob," he said, "you are different. You're not like all the other Native people. I mean, because if you look around the streets, you see people begging for money."
Right. Okay.
And he said,
all the other Native people.
Yeah, and he said, after all the other Native people, they don't want to work. They just want money from welfare, because
this was this morning.
This was this morning on my way. This is 2016.
Yeah.
He said they have the feeling that, hey, was my country and you took it away, and so give me money. Well, that's not the case. And when you're looking at the guys that are sitting out there saying, hey, dude, give me some money, apparently over 80% of all Native students in Ontario actually attend provincial schools, but score at least 10 points less on standardized testing in arithmetic and reading and things of that nature. Now, let's assume that, as in my case here in Toronto, you get sort of pushed from one level to another, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, and you really don't learn how to do all this sort of thing, but you're passed anyway. Now, all of a sudden, you come to Toronto, the land of opportunity, and you can't read properly, you can't count properly, you have a face that looks like you just came out of the bush, you speak with a dialect. Do you think you're going to get a job at McDonald's? No. So you wind up on the street, hey, dude, give me some money, and you become the target for every drug dealer in town. Now, to change that sort of thing, I think will take generations. And there are a lot of changes that are taking place in beginning. But when you look at the fact that there are so many reserves that don't have clean drinking water, and yet the Canadian government is so happy to send water treatment plants to any disaster throughout the world. So how come we can't have clean drinking water? And now, in this, I think in the Star, I saw a headline perhaps last night that from Grassy Narrows, somebody's done some research into the mercury poisoning that has been going on for years and years and years. So all of those kids grew up with mercury poisoning that impacts your brain.
Oh yeah, and little bits of it over time, right? It's that incremental, what it adds up to.
You see what I mean?
Many years. Well, it's what a metaphor too for the structure and the ideology and the political and all of that, right? For how deep this stuff goes.
So perhaps what we should be doing is looking at, first of all, not hiding this sort of thing.
Right.
Everybody has to know about it.
Right.
And when I was growing up in school, nobody told me about that kind of thing. And so now allowing it to get out there and not saying, you shut up. You sit up straight like a good little Indian and be quiet, which is what people still do to me. Oh, don't talk about that.
Oh, so you still do get, you could in a dinner conversation, for instance.
I was criticized for talking to the media. And the media, I didn't pick the media. Other people sent the media to that thing. And I was criticized afterwards by non-Native people for even daring to discuss the fact that I was thrown out of school and why.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding.
Wow.
And this is 2016.
Yeah, see, that's just, to me, is insane. That you're given a platform 55 years later afterwards, and somebody's saying, you know what, can we move on, right?
Yeah.
That's probably what they really want, right? That's a messy part of our history. Are we done with that?
But is that any different from my friend this morning walking down the street saying, they're lazy, they don't want to work?
Not a whole lot. Do you think it's guilt? Do you think it's racism still?
No.
Is it,
I think that what it is the social attitude. The common social... in other words, people are... if you believe, for example, that you should stop at stop signs, you stop at stop signs. Well, anymore... probably thanks to the commercialization of television and all that, you deserve a break today. You deserve a Cadillac. You deserve this, that, and the other thing. How many people stop at stop signs anymore? It used to be you had to have the wheels stop. Now they roll right through them. And, oh, well, it's that same kind of thing. In other words, if the society believes a certain point, you behave according to those things.
Sure.
So my friend, a lot of people in the society still think that Native people are behaving that way simply because we're lazy, we don't want to work.
Right.
So how to change
gamblers and alcoholics, all the massive stereotypes. Do you think it's changing?
Well, I do think it's changing because I was actually on stage at Burnamthorpe Collegiate, and I had the feeling that it was my graduation after 55 years. So it is changing. And when you have a look at even the fact that you and I are sitting here because of the blanket exercise.
It's true, the blanket exercise, right?
You see what I mean? There are many things that are changing. And I believe that is part of reconciliation, and in particular part of urban reconciliation. the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and that dealt with the residential schools. I don't think they were really focused on things like Toronto and the number of Aboriginal people that we have here.
So urban reconciliation, can you unpack that a little bit? That's really interesting. I don't think I've heard that phrase before quite in this context. So what was going on in the city while these other things were happening in rural communities that no one really knew much about? There was still a lot of that similar, like you say, the feeling at Burnamthorpe was very similar to what was actually happening elsewhere. Is that kind of what you mean by urban? Like the
how many Native people do you think there are here in Toronto?
Yeah,
I take a guess.
Oh wow,
3 or 4?
Yeah, I don't know what the percentage would be. It's probably higher than you think.
Well, the last figures that I saw were talking about 70,000 people. But those very often, when organizations go looking for how many Native people there are here, they go to the social welfare thing.
Right.
And they don't realize we have people, like, I'm not the only one with a PhD, and there are people that run their own businesses and everything else. So the figures are probably much higher, especially if you begin to expand it to include the number of Métis people, or even people that have one descendant from here or there. So in the Toronto District School Board, say 4 or 5 years ago, it was thought that there were something like 450 students, Native students. Today, thanks to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and self-identification, already there's something like 1,800 have self-identified, and that is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of people here, but since we're not all combined in one area, like Chinatown, for example, that means that we're spread right across the probably all across, not just the GTA, but even outside of it. And so that means that we can be forgotten, we can be pushed to the side, we can be dismissed because there's not enough. There's probably only one of the arguments I've heard is that there's probably not more than 2 or 3 Native kids in the entire school, so why should I learn about Native art history?
Sadly, we're going to have to wrap up our conversation soon. We're going to have to do a part 2. Would you say there's a sense of, there's a group within Native communities that are clearly wanting to talk about these issues, wanting to take it to the next levels, forming committees, going to the government, writing letters, becoming political? Is there also a group that's kind of said, you know what, for crying out loud, I'm done, I'm moving on, I'm moving out, or I'm moving somewhere else, I'm getting away from this? Is that happening with the younger generation, would you say? Or the opposite? They're becoming more proactive, they're becoming more, better advocates almost?
Quite frankly, I find that a little difficult to deal with because, for one thing, that question is one that would fit like pan-Indian. In other words, all Indians are the same, right across. No. Even the fact that there are 60 different languages. There are many, even here in Toronto. That's one of the difficulties about getting together to form one common block to elect a school board trustee, for example. Because you have Mohawk, you have Ojibwe, and everybody else all mixed in here. Some of them keep many of their cultures and traditions. Others try to hide it as much as they can because of the racism. When my great-grandfather bought that farm, afterwards he would tell everybody, no, I'm English, French, and Scotch. Otherwise you didn't get work in the mines. Right. And there I was, standing on the stage at Burnamthorpe Collegiate in my big robe, getting a PhD, and we had to stand for O Canada. 4 of the women from our department came out with hand drums and played the honor song just before that. And while that was happening, I began to think about my great-grandfather. If he was looking down, he would be so proud of me. So proud of the fact that I was actually graduating with a PhD in Indigenous Studies at a Canadian university, and up until 1950, if you did that, you were finished. And to my surprise, there was water started to stream down the sides of my face, and after O Canada, I dried it as quickly as I could by pretending I was blowing my nose. But afterwards, I ran into the Chancellor, and I was chatting with him, and I said, look, I became very emotional during the honor song. And he said, I know, I was watching you. So you can't hide. You can't hide a lot of things. And we can't hide, and there's no point in hiding the damage that was done by all of those things. And if non-Native people try to hide those things from themselves, I believe that the damage to them will be even greater.
Right.
Does that all make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Last question, and like I say, we'll book, once the recorder's off, we'll book part 2. But what little I know of you as we become better friends and so on, and I'm sure there's going to be ongoing conversations, you strike me as someone pretty hopeful. And you've been around. You've seen quite a bit from was it grade 12 you were kicked? So it was grade 12.
Yeah,
so
grade
kicked
12,
out of grade 12.
The second time around.
I mean, the taxi cab driving, the stories I've heard, there's so many things, and to become this Indigenous scholar. I mean, you've the graph on your life would be an interesting one. How's that? Why are you still hopeful? I'm assuming you are.
Yes, no, as it happens, I'm very optimistic.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I'm optimistic is that I recognize that Native people are the equal of anyone else. And one of the reasons that I recognize that is that my parents, in spite of the denial, I believe they passed on to me concepts that are current in the Native community, not just in my family, but all across the country. And one of those is that I am no better and no worse than anything else on Mother Earth. I'm no better and no worse than any of the animals, the dogs, the cats, the birds, the fish, and certainly no better and no worse than any other human being. And if I'm no better and no worse, well, then I must be equal. So hopefully that kind of an attitude...
it's a pretty good place to start, it seems to me.
Well, once our people begin to be treated a little better, I think that our people will become a very, very powerful thing that helps drive Canada to a really good place.
Bob Phillips, he's a Doctor of Indigenous Studies and an Aboriginal Arts Specialist, 10 years as a producer and host on Aboriginal Voices Radio Network in Canada, and more importantly, he was my guest today. Bob, thanks a lot for joining me. I really appreciate your time and your generosity.
My pleasure. Chima Kuchi.